So tonight, we have a very big guest. It is my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Prime Minister, Andrew Holness.
Good night, Khalil. Good night to all your listeners from around the world.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. We sent in the official request about a month ago, and I really thought we'd be sitting here waiting for months and months on end. So I was surprised to get the call that you are ready to join us. So welcome.
Well, Khalila, let me say that you have been an outstanding journalist, and you have paved a path in financial journalism that very few have managed to make a success of. And I want to commend you on your work in giving financial literacy access to Jamaicans.
Thank you so much. Well, let's start with one of the hottest button issues affecting everyday Jamaicans right now, and that is cost of living, inflation. Yes. Because when we look at the numbers, the economic numbers look pretty, We finally have achieved the growth, the 5%. It didn't happen 5 and 4. It was more like 5 and 9, but it happened. We've achieved that. We now have record unemployment.
Any way it comes. We take growth any way it comes.
We now have record unemployment now at 4.5%. But when we go to the supermarket, it's just licking us in our pocket, left, right, and center. So what is the government doing to deal with inflation?
Well, we lost you for a moment there, but I suspect your question is, what is the government doing about inflation? First of all, the government established a very strong policy on inflation targeting, which is done primarily through the central bank. And the governor of the central bank is tasked with ensuring that our inflation rate is captured between 4 and 6%. That's the inflation target. The pandemic, however, has disrupted all of that, and not just for Jamaica, but globally. And we were as high as 12%. The central bank, which is tasked with managing inflation, using one of its main tools, which is the interest rate, they have used this tool, in my mind, very well to curb inflation. So they have increased interest rates, and they have done it in a very judicious way, and that has brought our inflation rate down to about 6.6%. That's just above the target, but still within reach. And I think that if we continue in the near term, we will see inflation in Jamaica going back to where we had targeted it. That is between 4 and 6%.
The interesting thing about that, though, is that even though we say inflation is down to 6.6%, it's still up overall because the damage was done between last year and this year when it was 10%, 12%. And now the rate of increase isn't as much as it was last year, but it's still going up.
So there's another thing the government has done. There's another thing that the government has done, Khalil, in recognizing that the inflation has cost fixed income earners. It has cost us in terms of purchasing power. And so we have increased where we have the leverage on wages. We have done that. So we have increased the minimum wage, and we are going through a very comprehensive public sector compensation review, which would have seen an increase in general wage levels. And the governor of the Bank of Jamaica was also in the mix in trying to send a signal through moral suasion to the private sector to say, let us have our increases in an orderly way, because what we wouldn't want to introduce in the mix is wage inflation.
Right. So as you mentioned that issue, the point that the BOJ governor made, a lot of people were confused about that because, as you mentioned, the government recently increased public sector wages. So why all of a sudden is there now an issue with private sector doing the same when the public sector has set the pace for wages?
I'm not going to be drawn into that debate, Khalila, except to say that Jamaica is in a very different place than it was, say, 20 years ago. And that place is we are practically, for all intents and purposes, at full employment. And the definition of being at full employment is that you could have inflation being driven by wage competition. So it is something that we have to be very careful of. Not everyone will immediately realize this point, but it is something that our economic planners have to pay close attention to.
So speaking of that issue, Devin says, so how come politicians get 200% and teachers get 20? My question to you is, in hindsight, do you regret giving yourself and other parliamentarians that large of a raise, given the current
I'm happy for the question. I'm happy for the question. And by my own actions, I think you could easily see that I was not comfortable with the increases, because we understand the nature of our politics. We understand that the Jamaican people indeed want to see their elected representatives act in solidarity with the entire country. Now, there are disparities, of course. The increases given to ministers and other members of the political class would have been greater than, let's say, what the average teacher would get. But there is a point that should not escape us. The old salary structures were inefficient, confusing, anomalous, and did not support a system that would lead to greater productivity, greater output, and greater accountability for performance. And so what the government did was to take a very comprehensive approach. We hired one of the largest consulting firms to assist us to look at the entire public sector, restructure it, and make it an orderly, logical, and cohesive compensation structure. There were over 300 points of classification within the old structure. We have narrowed that down now to 13 levels, which is far more manageable. And the process that we are in now is to ensure that all public sector workers are fitted into this new structure. Now, what that has done is to set us up now for the next phase of our development, and that is the proper and full institution of performance-based pay. So where we are now is that we have corrected all the anomalies in the old system of compensation. An anomaly, for example, where a permanent secretary or other members of the public service would earn more than, let's say, a minister who is responsible and bears that responsibility for an entire ministry. Bear in mind as well that ministers and parish councillors, for example, did not get any adjustments since 2002. So the adjustment that is being done now, which would see them move by 200%, that's 200% on a very low base. And therefore, yes, it does seem to be unfair when you just take this figure without the context of where their salaries were before. Having done this now, however, and established a proper hierarchy and relationship to roles and responsibilities and risks and time and effort, we are now at a point that if going forward we maintain this, we give the increases as they are due and increases based on productivity, Jamaica will never have to go back to this period again where it had an anomalous compensation system, where persons with greater responsibility, greater roles end up getting sometimes less pay than the people they supervise. And this was a part of the challenge. And if that exists in your system, and if it exists particularly in any wide scale, it is going to have an impact on the productivity and efficiency of your entire public sector system.
So when we look at this entire situation that the country is facing, the cost of living, price of goods, rent is going up, school fees gone up like crazy, especially in the prep schools because of the increases in the public sector school, the teachers increase and so on. How do we cope? What do we do, the ones on the ground who still have to find the money for the school fee, who still have to find the money to feed our children, who still have to find the money to try buy a house if you can, or afford rent, which is just through the roof right
I
now?
want to give Kalila, I'm so grateful for this program. And I want to use it to give hope to the Jamaican people. I think I've been around long enough to see several back to school periods. And it is during back to school that the hardship really comes out because parents have to make household allocations in favor of education, and other areas will suffer. Poor households sometimes aren't able to make these kinds of allocations. But whilst the struggle continues, whilst definitely there are Jamaican households struggling to send their children back to school, I took the time yesterday and today to just analyze the back to school period. And it is clear that it went off seamlessly in most instances. This is not just because the Ministry of Education put things in place and the systems are in place. It is because the economy is recovering. It is because more persons are employed. And even if the income is a little bit lower, and though we have increased the minimum wage, and there is still the impact of inflation, the truth is that more Jamaicans have jobs and therefore more households have income. The allocative decisions are still difficult. You have to make a choice between sometimes buying a full basket of food or buying books. And I'm hoping that the Jamaican people are making the right choices with their limited incomes to invest
What is
in
the
things
right
like
choice?
education,
What is the right
housing.
choice in that situation? Books or food? Those seem
It's
like
not,
two
it's not,
non-negotiables.
well, I'm not prescribing, and I'm very careful to do that in our democracy, but I can give guidance. I think that if you want to see a permanent change in your circumstances, you ask, what should we be doing? In our perpetual struggle as a people, from the plantation to where we are now, we have to recognize that the struggle is not going to change by us giving up hope or throwing up our hands or making perverse choices. Our conditions and circumstances will change if we acknowledge that, yes, things are difficult. As Bob Marley said, rain or fall, but the dirty tough. If we change our perspective and say the dirty tough, but rain is falling. Things are difficult, but more people are getting employed. Yes, we had a terrible bout of inflation, but it was Jamaica alone. And the government has increased the minimum wage. The government has put $112 billion more into public sector compensation. The government has put in place what we call a social pension. So for those persons who weren't contributing to NIS and who didn't have a pension from previous employment, if they're 75 years and older, they can register for some support. The government has increased the support for the PATH program. So we're cognizant that things are difficult. We will never, ever deny that. The struggle is real. The challenges are real. I see it every day. But things are improving. And so now is not the time for us to take a pessimistic or fatalistic view of the future.
Mm. Well, let's talk about taxes, PM, because that's one thing that is in your control as we talk about inflation and how people deal with it. Is it feasible to lower taxes at this time to make things a little bit more affordable for ordinary people?
Kalila, as you know, as someone who is in the financial system, taxes are distortionary to how a free market would work. But they're an effective tool for gathering revenues, but they're also an effective tool for promoting or dissuading industries or consumption patterns. What we do not want to do with taxes is to play around with them too much. The policy of this government is to keep taxation stable. Once you price in what the tax is, regardless of what your income level is, but once you can price it in and you know that this tax is not going to increase on you, you're in a far better position. So a stable tax system is one that Jamaica has benefited from since this government has been in this running the administration. And I think people take it for granted that the taxes have been stable. But if they were to reflect on the 10 years before when taxes were unstable and how difficult that period was, then I think a greater appreciation would be had for what this government has done in keeping taxes stable. Having said that, we are a government that is committed to lower taxes. And we did that with 1.5, and we did that by reducing GCT. And it is our commitment. I don't want to say too much now, but I think the Jamaican people can rest assured that you have a government that believes in letting you keep more money in your pocket and letting you decide what you do with your income.
As you mentioned, 1.5, that was a big plank in your election campaign. The first time, well, second time around, first time you won as PM. And, somebody like me, who had to pay, still has to pay PAYE. I don't take that for granted. I appreciate that. But that was 9 years ago, 8 years ago. And things have changed. Inflation has taken off. And so now we're wondering what's going to happen with that income tax threshold. Is it time to raise that threshold again or eliminate that tax once and for all? Because you did say that you want to move from, what was it called?
Direct
to indirect taxes. Yes. And this is a question echoed by Christopher, who says, Honorable PM, do you think it's time for PAYE tax-free threshold to be adjusted?
Right. So as I said before, it is something that we are reviewing. And I don't really want to be pulled too much into it. But since yes, it is something that the government is favorably disposed to. We are indeed looking at it, having made all the adjustments with the compensation review, considering inflation, considering where we are in the economy. Yes, it is something that we are considering. Again, just to give the assurance to Jamaican people that when you talk about a Jamaica Labour Party government, you're looking at a government that first of all wants to keep taxes stable, and then as the opportunities present themselves to reduce taxation generally.
I feel like you're saving that one for the next election.
So please don't let me reveal it now.
When is the next election going to be, by the way?
Well, whenever it is due.
And it's due, what, next year? 2020? No, so it's due 2025. Because we had an election.
The elections are constitutionally due. Kalila, let me jump in here quickly. Elections are an absolutely necessary part of a democracy. They define the democracy. But they can be very disruptive because the electoral cycle does not always match the economic and policy cycles. And so that has to be managed very carefully. You wouldn't want elections to cause people to, for example, change their investment decisions, to say, well, you know what, I'm not going to put my money in until I'm certain where the government is going. That will slow up economic growth, which is why we have always tried to have the election period very short and routinely called when it is due. So just to put everybody at ease, I think Jamaicans right now should not get distracted by elections. When the elections are due, we will have them. But right now, let's keep our long-term vision and not let the election cycle interfere with economic and policy cycles.
Okay, let me take some questions from our Instagram and TikTok followers. PM, when I said you're coming on, the questions came flooding in. Everybody has something that they want to ask you. So here is one from Johnny. Johnny wants to know what's being done to lower fuel costs.
That's a question that fuel costs are not necessarily within the managing them within the purview of government. It's really the international prices. We are price takers for fuel. However, Petrojam does try to ensure that we have the best contract prices for the fuel that we purchase. Bear in mind as well that a large part of our fuel imports are also done by the private sector. And so the market forces are at work to try and keep the prices down. They're trying to get the best prices on the international market.
Justine wants to know, how is digital currency going to improve the financial situation of Jamaica? And is there a strategy to improve our dollar?
Well, let's start with the dollar. If you want a success story, it is the stability of the Jamaican dollar, and it is stable, not in any artificial way or any managed way. Jamaica has a free-floating currency, basically. Probably one of the few countries in the region that has that. And that is an amazing achievement, considering what we used to pay to keep the dollar stable. Not many Jamaicans realize that we used to keep interest rates high, and we used to find ourselves at the mercy of speculators just to try and have a target price for the dollar. No, the dollar is relatively stable using market forces and proper management from the BOJ. So that's an achievement that all Jamaicans can have pride in. In terms of the digital currency, there was an unfortunate debate which surrounded the government trying to eliminate cash, which that was never the case. There is a global trend that digital forms of transactions are increasing innumerably. And it is eventually going to be the case that digital transactions will probably, in years to come, outnumber cash transactions. Jamaica has to put itself in a position to have the infrastructure to facilitate digital transactions, and a digital currency is one such infrastructure that has to be put in place. So the Bank of Jamaica has put in place our central bank digital currency, which is available. It has not been as widely and universally made available as we would like, but we have made that positive step towards that. But that is just one form of digital transactions. And when you look at the banking reports, you will see that a significant number of local transactions are moving to online and digital platforms.
But there is a lot of skepticism about digital currency and a lot of pushback against it. Every time I post a video about it, people tell me I'm Mark of the Beast and I'm this and I'm that, all kind of foolishness. But do you think it makes sense for Jamaica to be pushing digital currency when it appears that the majority of the population is against it?
So we're not pushing a currency on anyone. Jamaica is a democracy. And what we try to do always is to preserve options for persons. So if you want to use cash, there should be the option for you to use cash. But if you feel that you are up to the digital world, then that option is there for you. Now, there is a huge difference in terms of efficiencies, in terms of potential for economic opportunity in using digital platforms versus using cash and in-person transactions. We saw that during the pandemic. If it is one thing that the pandemic did, it is to open up the acceptance of digital means for settling transactions. So what Jamaica is doing is to ensure that we have the infrastructure to both carry our traditional means of transactions, cash, and to certainly expand in the digital domain to ensure that Jamaica is not left behind in this new form of settling transactions.
So PM, over on Instagram and TikTok, by far the number one question that people wanted me to ask you was about SSL. We know that the entire situation has eroded investor confidence. The markets have been performing poorly all year. And now we have this announcement by your finance minister that the government is going to be paying SSLs operational expenses to the tune of $15 million a month. So I have this question from Instagram. Why do taxpayers have to pay for SSL's criminal operations, quote unquote? How are we being held accountable and not those governing that corrupt entity?
Yeah, I do share the sentiment, and I can understand how people feel about the SSL matter. But I just wanted to be clear. SSL, in the grand scheme of Jamaica's non-bank financial sector, it would be relatively small, but its impact and the signal it sends is one that is disturbing on several levels. It hasn't really, in my estimation, shaken the financial system, thank God. There are robust institutions and a strong regulatory framework, though it did show up some areas that need to be tightened up. But on a social level, it has raised this issue about whether or not private decisions that lead to business or financial failure, whether or not those private decisions should be, as they say, socialized into public debt. So when private businesses make profit, the public doesn't really benefit. I mean, the public may get taxes and so forth, but the private person holds the majority of the benefit. So the public is right in asking, why should the public then have to pay for fraud or poor management of an institution? I want to repeat my position, which I had made very clear, that the government of Jamaica will not be in any way taking on any debt of any private institution that has failed. We are not going to bail out any private institution that has failed. We went through FinSAC, and we are determined not to repeat that in any way, shape, or form. But the public is also asking that this matter be thoroughly investigated, and the government made a commitment to thoroughly investigate the matter. It is one of those conundrums, because in order for the matter to be thoroughly investigated, even with the FID and with the appointment of a special investigator to deal with this matter, and with the regulatory authorities also supervising, the truth is that we need the staff of SSL to keep the computer systems up and running. We need the staff of SSL to maintain the records. It would be a far more expensive exercise if SSL were to close tomorrow and the staff goes home, and then the investigators on their own having to try and piece together the puzzle. So I think the Minister of Finance found himself in this quandary where, having known my very strong position that we're not bailing out any company, having now to see to it that the infrastructure to facilitate the investigation, which the public would want to see come to some conclusion, that we ended up having to pay for, but only a short time, the maintenance of the staff. None of this is going to the principals of SSL or indeed to anyone who had invested in SSL. This is primarily just to keep the operation there, which is necessary to facilitate the investigation. I just wanted to emphasize that. So my point is, I feel just like how everyone feels in the public, that the principals of SSL or people who invest there, the public is not going to pay for that. But what the public would want to see is that we are able to track and trace and recover the funds that have been defrauded and have it returned to the people who were defrauded of their funds, and that is the cost of actually getting that done.
Is there a deadline on how long the government is going to continue paying these operational expenses?
I had a briefing last night from the Minister of Finance, and it's very difficult. I asked the same question. Very difficult to establish a time, as in a date, but I've been assured that the investigations are at an advanced stage. The FID reported progress to us last week, and so is that any support would be very short term, and interpret short term to be months, 2 or 3.
Okay. All right. So the last thing I really want to ask you about, PM, is crime. That was another one that a lot of people underscored, that they said, please make sure you ask Andrew about crime and how it relates to business. Of course, this is one of the major, if not the number one reason that Jamaica has not been growing as fast as its potential, as fast as it can, because we have to deal with crime. Employers have to spend extra money on security. It's just one of those things that we have to get right, that we have to be able to solve somehow. So give us an update on what you're doing about Jamaica's crime problem.
So I like the way you've asked the question, which you've hit the nail on the head, that crime is an economic cost to the country. And we pay for it in having to make additional expenditure for security, additional cost for things like ensuring our health system deals with the victims of crime. But more and more, we're seeing other costs of crime. And primarily, we're seeing it through the cost of violence. Our society has become violent to a toxic level. And it is costing us as a people on an interpersonal level. The cost of social transaction is very high. And you are seeing it in increased cases of mental health issues. We are seeing it with grossly deviant behavior, with gruesome crimes. We look at the recent slaying of an 8-year-old girl. We're seeing it in...
Today had a family.
Yes, and we're seeing it in the organization of violence. So we have a problem with organized crime, organized criminal gangs who are set up to pursue economic opportunities illegally. So you see it in the lottery scamming, you see it in the contraband, you see it in drugs and so forth. But it becomes a much more difficult and intractable issue when they use violence as a tool. So it's not just about committing a robbery. It's you're going to kill everyone that you see in the store. It's not just about sharing up the money of the lottery scamming. You end up in an argument over, oh, that is shared, and you end up killing 3 or 4 people in a community. And then that translates into just general violence. So we have a problem with not just crime, but the real problem is treating with violence. So the short answer is we have put in place significant investment to treat with crime. And I'm pleased to report that murders, for example, are almost 11% down over last year. Shootings are about 9% down. Robbery and other serious violent crimes are down by 20% on average. So we're getting good results from the investments that we're making. Still a long way to go, but we're seeing more results in increasing the size of the police force and the military, in increasing their capabilities, particularly in communications and transportation, and in building out their intelligence network, and in terms of training, giving the police special training. And I must commend the JCF. They have some very well-trained special operational personnel in their ranks that are basically now being able to deal with lottery scamming, anti-gang operations, and so forth. So we are making progress on the crime level. You would note that, for example, a case with the 8-year-old girl, Danielle, who was killed, may have taken years or months before to find the perpetrator. With the excellent investigative work and the use of technology, we were able very quickly bring to justice the person who has been charged. And then you would have seen that with the Beryllium case and other cases that the police have been able to interdict persons for that. So I would say that yes, it does feel sometimes very scary when we talk about the crime issue, but crime we're getting under control. Where we have a challenge now is the use of violence. And that is the next phase of the government's strategy. We have put in place.
What's the difference? Crime versus the use of violence. What do you mean by separating those two?
Right. So so in other words, you have societies where there's a lot of crime. There are a lot of people are breaking the law, whether it is they're doing robberies or rapes or other such kinds of criminal activity. But the issue for us is the organized use and indeed the general use of violence to the point of taking life. So it is a disregard for the person and a total disregard for life. And that is what we're struggling with now in Jamaica. And so we have recognized this, that we have to treat with violence in our interpersonal relationships, violence in our intimate partner relationship, violence in our domestic disputes. One of the things we have picked up, because we are bringing gang-related crimes under control, we are seeing an upsurge in these kinds of interpersonal and domestic violence. We're seeing brothers killing brothers, father killing son, daughter killing father, and we're seeing a number of these kinds of violent acts coming to the fore. So we have put in place now the National Commission for the Prevention of Violence, headed by Professor Sams Vaughan, who will shortly deliver a report to us. And once that report comes to us, then we will put in place an entirely new structure, which may even mean a new ministry dedicated to treating with just the family, social development, social interaction to ensure that we are a less violent society, so that we don't rely on the use of fatal force or force that causes injury or trauma in the resolution of conflicts.
If there's one thing that I wish you much success on, and I wish you success on many things, but the number one thing would be crime. I really, really hope, and I know it's a priority for the government, I really, really hope that you're able to achieve the crime reduction plans and the decrease in the use of violence, as you pointed out, because that would make such a major difference, not just for our quality of life here, but also for business and for the perception of Jamaica by people who may want to do business with us but are scared to invest here.
You have put it in, your insight is to be commended. The crime and the violence is now affecting our brand. You would recall in the early days, our tourism slogan was Jamaica, no problem, easygoing, happy, peaceful people. Now, with the level of crime that is creeping onto the international stage, and people with social media, we have a tendency to circulate all the gruesome pictures and the gory details. It is impacting on how people see us as a destination. And we have to be careful of that. It's creeping into everything. It's creeping into our music, creeping into our daily interaction. And as a society, we have to be cognizant of it, that being violent is not the only way to exist, that there is something for civility and decency and being loving and caring about your brother and your sisters.
Yeah, and it's not new, because when I moved here, I moved to Jamaica 15 years ago, and everybody said I was crazy. Jamaica? Crime? You're not afraid?
But I would say to you though, Kalila, that it is not a Jamaica problem. I know your homeland, Belize, is having similar challenges.
That
I
is
speak
very
with your
true.
Prime Minister, with Prime Minister Briceño quite a bit. Trinidad and Tobago, they are facing similar challenges. It is a very interesting time in our development as developing countries, and it is studied, I think, but I think more academic resources ought to be put into it as to why is it that countries like Jamaica have this level of violence. It could be a result of post-slavery, post-colonial issues. But it could also be how we treat with freedom. There are other countries in Latin America who have this similar problem, and they have taken a particular direction in treating with it. So there is also the issue of how do we treat with our freedom, and what do we use our freedom to abuse it, or do we use our freedom to protect our rights? And these are questions that a society needs to confront and answer.
Is the PM frozen? Is he there? Okay.
No,
yes.
I'm not.
Okay, I thought we lost you for a second there. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Prime Minister. There are many, many, many more questions in the chat. Unfortunately, guys, I can't get to all of them. We'd be here all night, well into tomorrow. I think we got to most of the major ones that we've already taken you beyond the agreed time. So thank you once again for being on Taking Stock, your first time, hopefully the first of many more to come.
Well, Kalila, again, let me commend you for creating this new pathway of financial literacy and financial entertainment, if you want to call it that, and for taking it into new media. That's a brave and bold new step, and I wish you all the success, continued success in this endeavor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you once again, Prime Minister.